Welcome back, Weirds and Weeboos, to the channel Division Doge, where today I'm covering Party House, one of the 50 games included in UFO 50, and yeah, the best one by far as I'm concerned. Very quickly, this is essentially a basic but deceptively deep deck builder. Even if the game doesn't explicitly use cards but guests instead, effectively that's what it is. Every single time you press A on the door, you'll let another person into the house. When you end the day, everyone inside the house will either reward you with popularity or money, and at the end of every day you can then invite more people to come to future parties. Though inviting them doesn't guarantee they'll show up for the next party, it's rather like adding it to your deck or your Rolodex. There's a chance they'll show up and there's a chance they won't. You spend popularity to invite more guests to your parties, and you spend money to make your house bigger so that you can fit more people in the house. You have 25 days to win, and the way that you win is to get 4 star guests in your house simultaneously. Star guests typically don't really give you all that much of a benefit, other than the fact that you need them to win. And unlike all the other guests, which are limited to 4 copies each, when it comes to star guests, you can buy an infinite amount of them. However, they cost a ludicrous amount of popularity, as you could guess. That for the most part covers how the entire game works, but there's just one more mechanic that is too important to gloss over. While for most effects that are guest specific, you know, I'm gonna have a cross that bridge when we get to it kind of attitude, this mechanic is so central and important to Party House that although it's technically tied to certain guests, it may as well be a rule of the basic game. Some of the guests that you'll be offered will give massive rewards, but cause trouble. And the downside of having troublemakers in your house is if you get 3 troublemakers in the house simultaneously without having any other mechanics in play to help mitigate the harm they're going to cause, that will cause the police to arrive and shut down your party for the day. You will get nothing for the day, and you'll have to choose someone to blame for what happened. Whoever gets blamed doesn't show up to tomorrow's party, but then gets added back to the deck afterwards. So overall, for as much as there is to this game, it's pretty easy to understand, and I've been absolutely obsessed to it to the point that I just had to do a tier list. But just before we jump in, I want to talk a little bit about general strategy that applies to the whole game, because it's important context for how I'm going to rank things on this list. You see, while obviously there are lots of smaller decisions that you have to kind of think on your feet in the moment, the general flowchart for what you want to do to win a game of Party House is generally pretty consistent, with only a couple forks in the road. The first one being, how should you start? And the answer for that is that you should start by focusing on money rather than popularity. Money can either be used to pay guests that give other special effects for paying them, or it can be used to expand your house, which is the main purpose of it. Either way, for the most part, anything that's going to cost you money is going to be a long-term investment. Whereas with popularity, although there are still plenty of things that you can buy with popularity that are going to be long-term investments, there's also things you can buy that would be immediate returns. As a result, it's a lot more effective to focus your money gain in the early game and then switch to focusing popularity as you pass through the mid-game. So usually, when you start, your number one priority should be looking at the guests you have available, looking for which one is going to be the best and most reliable moneymaker, and focusing that guest as much as possible. Now, I did mention there's already a small fork in the road from the very beginning here, and that's because sometimes the only money-making options you have available are a little bit steep in popularity cost, and you don't really have a lot at your disposal. While usually you simply just keep going until you can afford it, sometimes, if you have the option to, if there's anything you can buy that will give you a good popularity boost practically immediately, and you don't have to commit all too much to a synergy to be able to pull that off, then it can be a good idea to get something to just quickly boost your popularity at the very start of the game, just so that you can get to your moneymakers faster. Either way, that concludes sort of the early game phase. Then there's the mid-game phase, where typically you're looking for what's going to be the continual source of popularity for you. What synergies are you building your deck around? How are you actually going to get the popularity needed to get those star guests? And obviously the answer to that depends on the guests that you have available to you. This is where the second fork in the road is. In most cases, there will be some way to make a high synergy deck with the options that you have. And once you get this high synergy deck rolling, you'll have the ability to create effectively exponential popularity gain, to the point where when the deck really gets going, you're practically maxing out your popularity every single day sometimes. If you do have a hard snowballing synergy at your fingertips, then typically the mid-game lasts quite long, and you only start converting to your star guests in the end game once you've got only about 7 days or so left. On the other hand, if you don't have anything that snowballs that hard at your disposal, and you kind of just have to accept stuff that's good stats, but not necessarily getting better the more and more you invest into it. In that case, while you'll do better in the mid-game, once you get to the end game, your popularity won't be shooting through the roof. So as a result, it's a better idea to convert to your end game a bit earlier. However, either way, the end game basically plays out the same. The only difference being, depending on what your mid game was like, you'll either have a small amount of time and a lot of resources, or a lot of time but not too many resources. For your end game, you just focus star guests. Try and get 4 in the house at once. For the most part, you're just saving up popularity to buy more star guests, because even though you only need 4, you can buy more than 4 to increase your odds. And the only other thing you should be buying is anything that will help you search through the deck for what you need. So that's the basic strategy of how a normal game of Party House tends to play out. That just leaves one last thing I've got to clear up about the list before we get into it. That being the actual criteria for the ranking. Obviously it's based on how good I think the guests are, but in what context. It's easy to fall into the trap with a tier list like this of just ranking them by, I guess, how hyped they are, how excited you are when you see them. But there can be circumstances in which there is a guest that you're usually excited to see, but technically isn't very good for you, at least if we're talking averages. You see, Party House has 2 separate ways you can play it. There's the main sort of story, I guess, where you play through 5 pre-made levels, all with a preset list of guests. And then there's the random scenarios, where you deal with randomized guests and try and get as big a win streak as possible. Naturally, randomized scenarios are a lot tougher than the main story. Not only because the point of them is to go on win streaks, so you can't just lose once and try again. If you lose once, you lose all your progress. But also because the randomness, as you can imagine, can deal you some pretty rough hands. And you're going to be able to adapt to the tough circumstances pretty well to make some of these rough hands work. Considering that this is the much tougher way to play the game, and considering that once you've beaten the main story, which doesn't take very long, it's the only way to keep playing the game really, it really only seems fair that I make this tier list based off of random scenarios. Not to mention that random scenarios is the only area that you will be able to see every single guest in the game. But to be quite frank, if you're playing random scenarios, it's a little bit different than playing the story mode in terms of strategy. Probably the 2 biggest things that change is 1, while money is always important, money is especially scarce and especially coveted in random scenarios. If you get really unlucky, sometimes you're forced to deal with a set of characters with essentially no income. And when you're forced to do that, you have some really rough games. As a result, anything that makes money becomes exponentially better in random scenarios where decent money makers aren't a guarantee. Whereas in the story mode, every single level gives you decent options for income. Even the literal level whose whole point is that it gives you few options for income at least gives you a spy, which is a decent source of income, even if it's not the best. The other thing is, I guess, kind of obvious, but because this is based off of win streaks, we really value consistency here. Anything that can really mitigate our ability to lose. A lot of guests that can go absolutely nuclear and give you massive rewards that would usually be instant S tiers might not necessarily be there. Not even necessarily because they're bad or anything, but just because there's a risk carried with going for them. Whereas something that gets you enough to get to the finish line on a pretty consistent basis, but maybe isn't as flashy, would probably end up higher on the list. With all that said, I'm going to go in the order that you see the guests in the story mode. Let's get into it. I'll try and make this quick and painless, but to get it straight out of the way, I'm not really ranking the starter guests. In every game, you're forced to start with the same 10 guests. 4 old friends, 2 rich pals, and 4 wild buddies. Old friends just give 1 popularity and have no synergy, they're terrible. Rich pals just give 1 money and have no synergy, they're pretty bad. And wild buddies just give 2 popularity but cause trouble, and that's it. As a side note, there is literally nothing in the entire game that can remove something from your deck once it's in, at least not for more than a day. So unfortunately, you are stuck with these 4 wild buddies forever. Which is a shame because they are quite literally the worst guest in the game, intentionally so. In fact, they're the only guest in the game that you can't buy because there is literally no reason you would ever want to buy them. They are basically just 4 mines planted in your deck to make your life hard. As for old friends, as I mentioned, 1 popularity, as you can guess, is not a lot. You can do a lot better than that. And they have no synergies, so you shouldn't take them. I mean, you have the option to buy more of them, but you really shouldn't. And yes, there is 1 guest in the entire game that does synergize with old friends, but it's not a very good synergy. You're gonna have to wait until I get to the guest that we're talking about there before you'll know what I mean. Because of the fact that basically all of these are terrible and you don't want them, and that's basically by design, I've not really bothered to rank them, but I will very quickly say this. Technically, if I was ranking them, I guess the Rich Pal would probably end up in E tier rather than F. It's definitely the least terrible out of the starter cards, and the main reason it would go in E is, unlike every other guest in the game, you always have the option to buy these no matter what the random scenario maker spits out. So just the fact that they are a no strings attached way of making money that you will always be offered means they're at least not terrible. Sometimes you're going to want to get them on extremely rare occasions because you literally do not have a better option. But as you can imagine, generally you don't want to be getting these things. So that very quickly covers the starter characters. They're all basically F tier, except you could argue Rich Pal's like E tier. But effectively, they're not even really worth ranking. First up, we got the Driver. This guy only costs 3 popularity, which is very cheap, and he gives you a very useful ability. It's a one-time use, but once he's entered the house, at any time you like, you can select him, and he will allow you to pick literally any guest from your deck that isn't in the house yet to add to the house. As you can imagine, this is really powerful. You can even use it to pull your star guests in the late game when you're sweating trying to get them out. So you might be wondering how this guy isn't just broken and a stupidly OP character to start. Well, mostly just because of the fact that he himself takes up a slot in the house and gives you literally nothing. That's not to say that the Driver is bad, of course, but that's the main downside. Obviously, usually he will give you back the value you lose by taking him in consistency, and that's usually going to be valuable. But even then, if you're on a run where you're short on money and your house isn't very big, you're going to run out of space really quickly, and if you're clogging your spaces with drivers that aren't giving you anything, even if they're pulling something decent, it's probably not worth it. All that being said, I'm explaining why Driver is bad, not because I actually think it's bad. It's very good, it's just that it's kind of obvious how amazing being able to pull literally anything you want from your deck for such a cheap price is. Ultimately, I think Driver is B tier. It's a pretty good pick, and you're going to use it in a lot of decks, there's basically nothing it can't fit into. But taking it is basically always saying, I want less value for more consistency, which can be a very sensible thing to do, so long as you don't lose so much value you don't have access to your win con anymore. Next up is the Monkey! The Monkey! So you know how earlier I said that wild buddies are just landmines placed in your deck to make your life hard that you'd never want to even buy anyway, which is why they're the only guest in the game that you cannot buy? The Monkey is a great example why. The Monkey is literally just better than Wild Buddy. It costs only 3 popularity to buy, and it gives you 4, which is already a great deal. That's every time it's in the house. And of course it causes trouble, but so does Wild Buddy, and this gives double the amount Wild Buddy does. But it really says something that the Monkey is literally twice as valuable as Wild Buddy for no strings attached. And yet it's still not that great. It goes in D tier. Here's the thing with the Monkey. It's not that it's a bad idea to take troublemakers that give you a lot of value. It is a good idea. The main problem is that, of course, troublemakers, well, cause trouble, and you want to have as little trouble as possible typically. Even when you're running a deck that's centered around trouble, you only have so many things that can manage trouble. You're always making your odds worse by adding more trouble. So typically, you want to find one really good troublemaker that you can add to the deck and get a whole lot of money or popularity or whatever off of. And maybe you get a few copies of them and you call it there. You don't really want to be double dipping on troublemakers usually. And you see, that's kind of the problem with the Monkey. You see, it's not bad, but the fact that it doesn't make any money, and it makes good popularity, especially considering the cheap cost, but still doesn't make enough to be a solo carry, it means that if you're taking the Monkey, you're going to have to take other things to make your deck work. But those other things either are probably going to have anti-synergy with the trouble the Monkey causes, or are going to cause trouble themselves, meaning that you're causing too much trouble by taking both the Monkey and other troublemakers. Really, the ultimate problem with the Monkey is, the thing that makes it attractive is that its price is so low for something that gives you so much. But when you attach trouble to that, something which is equally as dangerous no matter how cheap it is, that's how that kind of falls apart. Now, obviously, the Monkey isn't in F tier. Is it absolutely unusable? Absolutely not. The main way I would recommend using it is getting literally just like 1, maybe 2 copies in decks where you can handle a bit more trouble than usual. Or it might be good to get a single Monkey in the early game if you need an extremely quick, practically instant popularity boost. I mean, it is an example of a guest that literally gives more popularity than you pay to get it in 1 day. so you can see how it can be great for giving instant popularity boosts. That being said, for the most part, any long-term synergy really doesn't want the monkey, so it's only really good for a risky but effective early game boost. Up next is security, which is the absolute bread and butter backbone of any functional deck. You see, at first, security might seem decent, but not much more. It's just a guy who, while he's in the house, at any time you want, you can have him kick someone out. Once they're kicked out of the house, not only will they obviously leave, but they also will be unable to re-enter the house for the rest of the day. Obviously, there are other uses beyond this, but the typical use of this is to deal with troublemakers. Got a bit too much trouble going on in your house? Just kick one of them out and keep going. Now, considering that this costs 4 popularity to buy, which is pretty cheap, but then also considering that it gives you literally nothing other than its ability, it might seem like this card isn't the best at first. Sure, you can use it to deal with trouble, but is that really the best way to do it? I mean, there are other options in this game that can deal with trouble for a similar price point that also give popularity or cash. Why would you want to take a guess that just clogs up space in your deck and doesn't provide you anything, except maybe a little bit of trouble mitigation? Well, beyond the obvious answer that, as you might have guessed, there are a couple more creative uses for the security guard we might get to later, honestly, the most important thing to drill in is just this. It's real simple. The guard can kick himself out. And that might sound really dumb. Why would you want to do that? Well, here's the thing. Let's say you get a guard really early on, and you're expecting trouble to come through the door, but no trouble comes through, and now you're mad because you have a guard that's just sitting there, taking up a space in your party, draining your resources, and he's not even doing anything. You could just have him kick himself out and then fill the rest of your party. As a result, taking security guards is a great way to look through your decks more safely. If you need to find certain things in your deck, you can use the fact that the security guard can boot out other guests as a way of managing your party and making sure that nothing goes wrong while you're looking for the things you're looking for in your deck, but you also don't have the downside that every other guest in the game has, where obviously getting more guests, even if it is to help look through your deck, will increase the size of your deck, making it harder to find a specific guest in there. Whereas the security deals with itself. It is a card that also removes another card. It is a net 0 card in your deck. So you can clog your deck with as many of these things as you want, and you'll never screw yourself. You'll never actually make your odds worse. Basically, the only thing you're losing is the 4 popularity you spend to put it in your deck in the first place. And listen, we're starting with all the cheapest guests here, but just so you know, 4 popularity is like nothing. So yeah, it's not even necessarily that security is an insanely powerful guest, it's practically free, man. Genuinely, a lot of these cards, it is literally more important that they take up deck space as a downside than the downside of them costing popularity to obtain. And so the fact that security can completely negate that downside for itself, as well as being a way to make your game far more consistent, means that there's basically no deck in the game that doesn't want a security guard. That being said, while it might sound like I'm gearing up to put this guy in S tier, and you could make an argument for that, I'm personally going to put him in A. And the main reason it goes in A tier rather than S is mostly just because, for as good as it is, for as much as I've been defending it, all of my defenses of it about how the bad things about it don't matter, about how it's a very safe pick. But in fairness, it's also not a pick that is going to add a whole bunch of value to your deck. This helps a greedy but unstable deck to stabilize. It does not help a deck that doesn't have a win condition yet actually get a win condition. Oh boy. Next up is the Ticket Taker. So I'm not gonna lie, there was a point at which I did a massive reshuffling of this list. And this is probably the single guest that moved the most for as mundane as they seem. In the original version of this list, Ticket Taker was going to be the sole guest, not part of the starter deck, that was going to end up in F tier. And the argument was pretty simple. At the end of the day, you're losing 1 popularity by adding this to your deck, and on top of that, it's only giving you 2 cash. Which is not nothing, but it's not a lot. This is a guest that is net 1 point. It's also a guest that has no synergies with anything in the game as far as I can tell. So if you just wanted to take a money-making guest that nets to 1 point, why would you not just take Rich Pal? It's cheaper and it's guaranteed to show up every time, whereas the Ticket Taker only shows up sometimes. And if you're being compared unfavorably to Rich Pal, wow, what does that say about you? But as you could guess by my tone, it moved up a little. Well, a lot. It's actually in C tier now. Yeah, this is why sometimes judging this based on random scenarios can get weird. I think that Ticket Taker in the actual story levels is absolute garbage. But when it comes to random scenarios, I'm sorry, man. I feel like there are only two ways if you play well that you lose in a random scenario. One of them is that with the guests that you're dealt, you're forced to build around trouble synergy, but you're given literally nothing that deals with trouble, and you just get some unlucky days and get loads of troublemakers. And the other way you can fuck up is if you're just given no money makers. If you just cannot make money, then there is just no path to victory aside from just praying you high roll. And so, do I like taking Ticket Taker? No. I know it's a terrible guest, and I know it feels so wrong putting it in C. But at the end of the day, my highest win streak on random scenarios at the moment, having recently bought this game, is 15. And I can't tell you how many times I was in a run that would have died, but I did at least have Ticket Taker there. And Ticket Taker kind of clutched it. Now, you might argue, oh, but surely there are better moneymakers out there than Ticket Taker. Well, you're right. There are a lot better moneymakers out there than Ticket Taker. Many of them. But that's kind of the thing. Every moneymaker in the game is so important that it's all, like, B tier and above. So it actually is kind of correct to put Ticket Taker here. It is the worst moneymaker in the game that actually makes serious money, but at the end of the day, it makes money. Anything that makes money really can't go below C tier. Not to mention, I hate to admit it, but I do think the fact that it's a net 1 stat is cancelled out by the fact that the way that it works out is you get 2 cash but lose 1 popularity. I really hate to admit it, but it is just true. Making 2 cash per turn is very different than making 1. Like, making 3 instead of 2 is a relatively sizable difference, but you can get by on just 2. If your only moneymakers are making 1 cash, you're in for a really, really bad time. So yeah, a lot of the time you would rather take Ticket Taker over Rich Pal. Admittedly, I bite that bullet. Yeah, I don't like that I have to put this high, but I do think it's true. And in fairness, I will give Ticket Taker this. It also has one other thing that even makes it a high C in my opinion. That being, there are 2 little things it does have over every other moneymaker in the game. One is that it's a very safe pick. There are a couple other moneymakers that are good safe picks, but actually most of the moneymakers in the game are troublemakers. And so the fact that this doesn't cause trouble, to be fair, is a pretty sizable upside. But the other thing is, in fairness, it is the cheapest moneymaker in the game, excluding Rich Pal, which means you can get it super early, and especially because of the fact that the cost to expand your house starts out stupidly low, but increases every time you buy it until it hits $12. That does mean that getting more money earlier leads to some pretty explosive starts if you can get some lucky rolls. I'm sorry, I'm yapping, I just really don't like that I have to put this guest in C tier, but I do think it's true if I'm being honest with myself. Next up is Watchdog, and you might be a little bit surprised about where it ends up. You see, I don't think people typically think of Watchdog as a terrible guest or anything, but probably not one of the better ones. But honestly, the longer I've played this game, the more I'm convinced that maybe peeking the door is a little underrated. You see, that's the mechanic that the Watchdog provides. It essentially just gives 2 popularity, but the bonus it gives is the ability to 1 time check who's at the door. You'll be able to see who will enter the house next the next time you open the door, and if you don't like what you see, you can boot them. And one thing the game never really makes super clear, but it's actually pretty big about this, is that this works just like the security guard. If you boot someone from the door using the Watchdog, it's not just the case that you won't get them next. It also means that they are completely kicked from the party for the entire day. Even if you do a reroll of some kind and you start letting people back in, the people that you denied with the Watchdog can never come back into the house. Not until the next day. As a result, the Watchdog is just a really, really safe pick. It only costs 4 popularity and it gives 2, so it pays for itself extremely quickly. In 2 days' time, you'll have gotten a return on your investment. It does take up a deck slot, but similarly to the security guard, because of the fact that it can remove another thing from your deck and help you look for what you want, it kind of negates that. Now in fairness, the security guard is a little bit better for that because of the fact you can choose who you want to boot with the security guard, whereas with the Watchdog, you're only going to be given 1 option. And if that 1 option isn't the one you were looking for, then they won't be replacing their deck slot, and they will be taking up a space. But again, considering that it actually gives you 2 points of popularity, which is not super impressive, but it's certainly serviceable. And I mean, early game, it is kind of impressive because it's the early game. it can be a good idea to pick up either a couple watchdogs in a deck that's a little bit unstable that you feel you need to have a bit more control over the outcomes of, or to take a watchdog or two early on to help deal with troublemakers in the early game. Not really much to say, it's just a really solid card. You don't really sacrifice a lot by buying it, and quite simply, the numbers on it are good. Next up is the Hippie, and when I was talking about earlier things that might have seemed better than the security guard at dealing with trouble, the Hippie is one of them. You see, the Hippie costs just as much as the security guard, 4 popularity, and gives 1 popularity for being in the house, unlike the security guard which gives 0. I'm not saying that 1 is a lot, it's just better than 0. And its ability is that having the Hippie in the house cancels out 1 trouble. As in, if you have a Hippie in the house and there are 3 troublemakers in the house, you won't get the police to show up. Not until you hit 4. This can also be nice because while sometimes you will genuinely want the troublemakers gone, with the security guard you're obviously kicking out the troublemaker. So that means that all the bonuses you get by having them in the house go away. Whereas with the Hippie, you can actually keep the troublemaker in there without having to deal with any of the trouble. So you still get to reap the stat bonuses for having brought them into the house. This is especially broken if you manage to combine it with Trouble synergy mechanics, since the vast majority of guests in the game that have synergy with Trouble are balanced around the idea that you can only fit 2 troublemakers in the house. So just having 2 in the house will be a huge payoff with Trouble synergy. Having more than 2 is an enormous payoff. And of course, Hippie makes that possible. So overall, the Hippie is a pretty safe pick, assuming that you're going to take troublemakers. It's not really worth it if you aren't, because although there are 4 troublemakers in the starting deck, not only do you not want to keep those troublemakers in the house, so you'd probably rather have security, the stat bonuses they provide are negligible, but also, to be fair, the Hippies themselves do kind of suck on their own. I mean, 1 popularity will be fine in the early game, but come the mid and late game, you really want even your most mediocre of guests to at least be given 2. If you've got 4 Hippies in your deck, and you keep drawing them constantly, but you're not even drawing enough troublemakers to justify having them, that's going to drag you down pretty bad. But of course, troublemakers are everywhere in this game, so it shouldn't be hard to find more trouble to pair with the Hippie to hopefully make it worth it. Just know that naturally, if you are going to pair Hippies with troublemakers, it's a high variance strategy. When you win big. But of course, you never know if you're just going to get 3 troublemakers in a row out the gate and not see a single Hippie, even though you have 4 in your deck. All that said, the Hippie is a pretty good guest. It goes in B tier. Next up is the Rockstar, the first guest on the list that costs 5, which, by the way, is still pretty cheap. And he gives 3 popularity and 2 cash, but causes trouble. Pretty basic guest, but pretty effective. It's a good source of money, it'll give you more than enough popularity to get by, and you can get it super early because it only costs 5. To put it in perspective, if you fill the house on day 1, you'll usually be getting between 5 and 7 popularity. So you can usually buy this guy day 1. And don't get me wrong, day 1 when you don't have many ways to deal with trouble, maybe getting him early does mean you have to end some days early to avoid risking getting arrested. But any single day that you end the day with a Rockstar in your house is a day you've won in the early game. Sure, maybe there are 3 empty slots in your house because you had to end the day early because you got double trouble straight away, but if one of those troublemakers is a Rockstar, then they're giving you 2 cash and 3 popularity, when the rest of your deck is mostly 1s. So even the 3 empty spaces that you're missing, take 3 away from that, that's still 2 points. And we're talking a like near worst case scenario there. The only problems with the Rockstar is obviously for one, he's a troublemaker. We do like consistency here, and unfortunately having Rockstar does make it difficult to be consistent. But so long as Rockstar is basically your only troublemaker, so long as you're not going like 6 troublemakers plus, and especially if you get things like watchdog, security, or drivers to help mitigate the situation, hopefully you should all be fine. The only other downside really is the fact that it is difficult to win off of Rockstars, as you can imagine. They have very high base stats, but they don't snowball. It is possible to win with Rockstars as your main strategy, but it's basically always suboptimal. It's always something you've been forced to do because you've been given a garbage hand, not something you want to do really. Either way, Rockstar goes in B tier. Next up is the Comedian, which might seem like a relatively simple guess, not all that noteworthy. You have to pay him 1 cash instead of him giving you cash, but in return, he will give you 5 popularity so long as the house is full when you end the day. I mean, there is the cash condition and there is the filling the house condition, but both of these conditions are pretty easy to meet. He only needs 1 cash, and filling the house so long as you're not over-investing in troublemakers should be a pretty easy task. And hey, the Comedian only costs 5 popularity to buy, and immediately gives you that 5 popularity back on literally the first payout. So this guess sounds pretty basic, but pretty good, right? But what if I told you I thought it was a little bit more than pretty good? I actually think that the Comedian is our first S tier, which might come as a shock to some people. Not that the Comedian's bad, but that they just seem so normal. How are they an S tier? Well, here's the thing. You can easily get 4 Comedians in the house. Very easily. They're very cheap, and it's very easy to meet their conditions. The fact that in a Comedian deck you want to keep the house full means you also don't want to invest in trouble, but that makes your deck more consistent even if it does mean less payout. Now, less payout hurts, but it only hurts enough if it means that you fall short of your goal. But I'm not gonna lie, if you're getting 4 Comedians in the house on most days, that's a 20 popularity boost basically every day, on top of the stuff that you're already gonna be making from other guests aside from the Comedians. In the vast majority of cases, just having 4 Comedians in your deck can be your entire strategy. And the reason why that's so good is because the conditions are ridiculously easy to meet. Again, most strategies in the game that actually get you enough to snowball into the late game and get everything you need, most of them are either really complicated, really high synergy, or they are really high risk, like Troublemaker synergy. When it comes to much more low-risk guests like this, they either aren't intended to be your endgame strategy and just do not give enough popularity to reach the star guests, or they do, but only if you convert to your endgame early and bite the bullet that you're not going to have as many resources and try to compensate that by spending more days on getting star guests. But the Comedian doesn't have to do either. He gets to be an extremely low-risk, extremely consistent, extremely easy-to-appease guest that also gives you just enough popularity that you get to rush star guests super fast, meaning that just getting 4 Comedians is a way to make a deck that is super consistent and has all the time in the world to get 4-star guests in the house. The only thing is, as I've already alluded to, I would highly recommend you don't take Troublemakers if you're taking the Comedian, or at least offset those Troublemakers with things that mitigate trouble. I should make it clear as well that it is preferable to just not take Troublemakers. You can take things that offset trouble, but again, remember, it doesn't matter how much trouble mitigation you get, you could always just draw 3 Troublemakers at the start of the day, and the chances of that disaster happening get higher every time you add another Troublemaker to the deck. But yeah, all that being said, typically filling the house is not a very tall order. Really surprisingly enough, what ends up being the real stinger is the fact that you have to pay in money, but even then, it's only 1 cash every time. So long as you're getting 5 popularity out of it, it should pay for itself. Oh yeah, that's one last thing I should mention. If you don't manage to fill the house, but you still have Comedians in them, you still have to pay them, and they don't give you anything. You should be a bit careful about that one. But as I say, it's pretty damn easy to fill the house, so as long as you don't make a deck where you're not capable of filling the house because of Troublemakers, you'll be fine. Immediately following the Comedian is a very similar guest that usually lives in its shadow, the Caterer. The Caterer is a pretty simple guest. It gives 4 popularity instead of 5, but it also takes 1 money away from you. That's it. It's essentially a Comedian, but it gives 1 less point for the benefit of not having the condition of needing to fill the house. As you can imagine, that makes it, on average, worse. So I'm not gonna lie, I'm kinda surprised that in the story mode they chose to put both the Comedian and the Caterer in the same level, because I'm not gonna lie, if you're offered both, you basically always take the Comedian over the Caterer. That being said, both of them are pretty good. The Caterer still gives 4 per, which yes, isn't 5, but it's enough. 4 Caterers is enough to make the popularity needed to buy 4-star guests. But unlike the Comedian, you might not get there with time to spare. It might be a bit closer. You might have to play it a bit safer when it comes to the end game to make sure you definitely get everything in time. So yeah, if you're relying on Caterers, you're essentially deciding that you have too much risk in the early or the mid game, and you want to make the early or mid game less risky by taking something basic like the Caterer, but you're making your late game riskier because of the fact that you'll have less resources and time to work with, and of course the fact that you're going to be paying him money which could have been used to make your house bigger. Overall though, from a pure statistics perspective, I can't lie, the Caterer is actually not a bad deal. So long as you know when and why you want to use it, it's not a bad guest. It honestly manages to crack B tier in my opinion. And lastly, for the many 5s in the first level, we have Mr. Popular. This at first seems like a very unassuming guest. They just give 3 popularity for being in the house, and the description just states, brings a friend to the party. This mechanic is weird, I'm not gonna lie. Essentially what this means is, when Mr. Popular walks through the door, he will force you to let another person in whether you like it or not, as you could maybe guess. And at first, the downside of that is pretty obvious. What if you're really worried one more troublemaker could ruin your day and you decide you want to hit that door one more time and you're like, oh phew, it's not a troublemaker. Oh wait, no, it's Mr. Popular, and then he brings in a third troublemaker through the door and you get arrested. And don't get me wrong, that is a very small downside of Mr. Popular, but there's also an equal chance that you just open the door and just get a troublemaker directly. Essentially what I'm saying is, since getting Mr. Popular when you need one more troublemaker to get arrested isn't just getting a troublemaker, it's kind of like getting a reroll, and if you didn't have him, there would be one less deck slot anyway for a non-troublemaker. It's ultimately, yes, something that makes you slightly more likely to get caught, but for the most part, you're not really in huge danger of getting arrested by taking people who bring more guests, at least when it comes to having too many troublemakers. It is a downside, but it is an extremely minor one. So at first, that might make Mr. Popular seem like a pretty appealing guest to take. I mean, the downside here seems extremely minor, and the upside is you got a 3 for 5, no strings attached. But I think there's two problems here. One of them, and I admit this is the smaller one, but that would be that 3 is an awkward number here for popularity. At 3 popularity, you're not really making enough to be the backbone of any deck. This is only being used for short-term gains and not a long-term strategy if you're getting it. And you gotta remember, when you add things you don't need to your deck, they clog up deck slots and make it harder to find the guests that you do need to win. So you can't really just take Mr. Popular because he's a good ratio of popularity gain to spend. It has to be because they actually provide you something that will help you reach your win con or put your deck together. And I'm not gonna lie, the only point at which he does that is right at the very beginning of the game if you need a popularity boost to be able to get your money makers early as fast as possible. But even then, as a popularity boost, 3 for 5? Not a bad deal, but not the best either. Again, the monkey is 4 for 3. And don't get me wrong, the monkey causing trouble is definitely a bigger downside, but if what you're looking for is instant returns on popularity, the monkey's kind of a lot better for this. But I've really been dancing around this the whole time. What's the real problem with Mr. Popular? Well, there's just one thing you might not have considered with this mechanic. What happens if the house is already full and Mr. Popular tries to bring another guest in? Now, what I thought would happen is his ability simply wouldn't trigger. Nope, that's not what happens. He does bring in another guest anyway, but the house is already full. So it becomes overcrowded, and once again, the fire department this time shows up and shuts the party down because it's too dangerous to continue. This is essentially the exact same as getting arrested. Now don't get me wrong, you could argue that this is not as bad as being a troublemaker, because of the fact that you can safely know that there's no chance that you're going to have your party shut down, so long as you don't ever open the door when there's only one space left and there's a chance that Mr. Popular could come in. And don't get me wrong, you can avoid getting your party shut down by leaving open spaces like that. But that's the thing. For the crime of adding Mr. Popular to your house, you now have to essentially play the rest of the game with one house slot gone. Now in fairness, I say that, I'm being a bit melodramatic. When you get Mr. Popular early in the day, and you know he's no longer in your deck, you can obviously fill the whole house safely. But I mean, what are you really getting for all this sacrifice? You're getting a 3 for 5. It's not even that good. And that's before I mention the last bit. You might say, okay, maybe one of them is not that good, but what if you get 4 of them? That would be a really efficient ratio, you know, spending 20 popularity to get in total guys that will make 12 popularity every single day. But then you make things even worse. Because Mr. Popular could bring Mr. Popular, who could bring Mr. Popular, who could bring Mr. Popular, who could then bring a 5th guest. That now means that when there are only 4 slots free, you still have to end the day early if you haven't seen a Mr. Popular yet. Because even with 4 whole house slots free, there is no guarantee that when you open that door, you don't have all 4 of them filled and then a 5th person try and come in and your whole party gets shut down. If you've been wondering why I've been harping on this for so long, it is because, believe it or not, we're already there. Mr. Popular is the only guest in the game I consider to be absolute F tier. And I like to go very hard with my F tier. When I have an F tier and a tier list, I really do mean, effectively, there is no use for this. It's not even like it's niche, it's not really worth it, but you can use it. It is, wow, you just can't use this. And that's Mr. Popular. The only justification I could give to myself for why this guy might have a use case is again that instant popularity boost. But as I said, even then, it's not really even that good. And considering the severe downside you're going to have for the rest of the game, the permanent crippling of both your money and popularity gain by the essential shrinkage of your house just by taking even one of these guys is nowhere near worth getting 1 or 2 more points of popularity in the early game. I have forced myself to use guests I typically consider to be garbage for this tier list, and I have forced myself, whether I like it or not, to change my mind on some of them. Cough cough ticket taker. And I think that Mr. Popular is the only one that my opinion actually got worse of. I initially thought, I'll probably put this somewhere like D. But the more I forced myself to use him, the more I realized, wow, there's actually no use case for this guy. And so he is truly the worst guest in Party House. Asterisk. That isn't a starter guest. Which brings us to the dancers. Guests that I kind of struggled to rank. You see, dancers are fun and quirky, but ultimately, I don't think they're that good. I'm going to be quite to the point on this one. I think that dancers are the worst synergy in the game that works. You can make a dancer deck and it can be the right decision. But if you have the option to do anything else, if anything else is on the table and feasible, you should probably do something else. You see, dancers are really simple. They give you 1 point for every single one in the house. So if there is 1 in the house, you'll get 1 at the end of the day. If there is 2, you'll get 4 in total. If there's 3, you'll get 9, and if there's 4, you'll get 16. And unfortunately, there's no way to copy guests, and as I mentioned, each one is limited to 4, so you cannot get more than 16. And again, remember, 16 sounds good, but that's 16 for taking up 4 slots of your house. So that's essentially just making each dancer individually a 4 popularity guest. So here's the main problem with dancers. As I mentioned before, adding literally anything to your deck that isn't part of your synergies or win conditions is kind of a dangerous game. Because of the fact that you cannot remove anything from your deck once you add it, it's in there forever. And again, the more stuff you have in your deck, the more trash you've thrown in there, the harder it's going to be to find the stuff that you need later in the game. Now, in fairness, buying guests is also how you adapt to changing circumstances in this game. So you have this awkward tightrope walk where even though you know you're supposed to not buy too many guests and not clog your deck, you also know that as different problems keep arising, the only way you can respond to them is to buy more guests. And usually the way that this is addressed is by taking guests that tutor a lot more or that help cycle themselves out, like security, like watchdogs, like drivers. I'm basically saying all this to say this. While it's always a benefit to keep your deck smaller if you can, and only take the things you need, if you're making a dancer's deck, it's practically a hard requirement to maintain a small deck. Dancers don't give a whole lot of value, honestly, even if you build around them correctly. Again, at best, they're just 4 popularity units. They're essentially just caterers you don't have to pay. But instead of having to go through the loops of paying them, you instead have to do worse. You constantly have to sabotage your own deck to keep it small enough that you can get them consistently, all 4 of them in the house, and then you also have to invest in tons of tutors and deck searching tools just to make sure you can get all 4 in the house as many days as possible. Every single day that you don't get all 4 of them in the house at once is a day where you're getting less popularity, with a synergy that already does not give you a whole lot of popularity. At the very least, because dancing synergy is simple, just difficult to execute, you can have a straightforward game plan. So long as you're prepared to spend a lot of days just saving up for star guests, you can just get 4 dancers, something that makes money, a bunch of stuff that helps you search through your deck or cycle through it, save up for star guests, and then repurpose the searching and tutoring tools to, instead of looking for dancers, look for the star guests. It's a functional strategy. It's just always a very sketchy one. You often barely make enough resources to make it, even though you do get a lot of time to do what you want because you don't have to invest in as many moving parts to make a functional deck. It kind of feels almost like you're supposed to use other synergies alongside dancers to supplement them, but again, doing that sabotages your dancers, so how does that work? I was very, very tempted to put the dancer in D for that reason. But at the end of the day, you are screwed if you're not given any kind of build around or synergy in random scenarios. So while I do think dancers are the worst possible synergy you could be offered that works, it is a synergy that works. And at the end of the day, I'm still going to use dancers if in a random scenario I am given a series of absolute garbage that I cannot work with otherwise. It really does feel weird putting dancers all the way up at C while saying how terrible they are. But at the end of the day, everything D or below isn't even really capable of being a build-around strategy. So, C tier it is. Next up is the Auctioneer, and honestly, I feel like I've got to apologize for being boring here, but I don't know, what can I say? Believe it or not, for as basic as this guest is, I think the Auctioneer might be the single best guest in the entire game. Like, no joke. Top of S tier. Literally, the entirety of the Auctioneer's functionality is this. They cost 9 popularity, and they give you 3 cash. That's it. And so I do not blame you at all if you're looking at this and you're like, what the hell? How the hell is the Auctioneer like, what? But, again, this is about consistency. Honestly, making this tier list really woke me up to how many sources of income in this game are unstable somehow. Even some of my favourite moneymakers in the game are extremely either unreliable or introduce risk simply by taking them. The Auctioneer is the only guest in the entire game to make 3 or more cash every single turn that doesn't introduce risk elsewhere. They just give you 3 cash every turn. Being able to make 3 cash every turn at 0 risk is huge. It allows you to rapidly expand your house so long as you focus auctioneers early, and do it completely safely while making no sacrifices to your main synergies. I'm not gonna lie, I basically think in random streaks, seeing an auctioneer is like being handed a free win. Because any random scenario where you have the ability to buy auctioneer, you can probably win by just rushing 4 auctioneers, and then literally you could probably just buy 2s. I'm not kidding, just buy things that give 2 or more popularity with like no risk or synergy. Just buy things that give number. And honestly, considering how fast the house will grow at such little risk, that will probably be enough to make it within the 25 days you have. Again, doing well in random scenarios is kind of all about mitigating risk when possible. And I'm not gonna lie, as boring as it is, this auctioneer strategy is basically a 0 risk strategy. The only risk is the wild buddies in your deck that you start with that you can't get rid of. And considering that this deck basically just entails you getting a bunch of auctioneers, you can absolutely afford to invest in some security or some watchdogs or some spies on the side to deal with those. So considering it is the single most consistent risk-free option to reach a win, considering it almost completely circumvents the need to even build a deck with synergy, you can just take these guys with no consequence and be on the pathway to victory. As bland as it might be, I'm sorry, I gotta give it to the Auctioneer. I think they're the best guest in the game. Definitely in random scenarios at least. The very top of S tier. Sorry if you're a bit disappointed that both S tiers so far have been pretty straightforward, but that's mostly just because this is the first level. A lot of the other ones are a bit more wacky. With that being said, there's only one less guest to talk about in the first level, that being its star guest, the alien. But of course, being level 1, we don't get to have cool things, so the alien's main gimmick is that it's the only star guest that does nothing. It costs 40 popularity to buy, and it literally only exists to be a star guest. So, I mean, you need to buy it because you need 4 of them to win the game, but it just sits in your house. It gives 0 popularity, it gives 0 cash, and it does nothing. Yeah, that's it. So, I mean, there's not a whole lot to say about it, and I don't really know where else it would go except C. I mean, it's fine, you can buy it. As you can imagine, when it comes to other star guests, they might have downsides attached to them to be cheaper, or upsides attached to them to make them more expensive. So obviously there's still some reason to pick an alien over other star guests if maybe they're a bit more expensive for an upside that you don't really care about, or if maybe their downside is disastrous enough that you're feeling worried to take it. But as you can imagine, it kind of goes both ways. It also means that the alien isn't very fancy. It's a very unimpressive star guest, kind of obviously. So yeah, I mean, where else would it go but C tier? But with all that said, and the first level's guests cleared out, I think this is unfortunately going to have to be the stopping point for this video. It's quite a monumental task to rank every single guest in the entire game, and I'm conscious of the fact that this is about 50 minutes long now. But I'll make sure to finish things off in the next video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.